Emma Carter wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, exhaustion creeping into her bones. She had been on her feet since sunrise, scrubbing floors, making beds, and ensuring the luxurious five-star hotel gleamed for its high-profile guests. Her black Maid uniform clung uncomfortably to her skin, and her fingers ached from carrying heavy trays all day. But she had no choice. This job was all she had. The bills were piling up, and her younger brother, Liam, needed his medication. The doctors had warned her, without proper treatment, his heart condition could worsen. She refused to let that happen. He was the only family she had left. "Emma, hurry up," her supervisor, Mrs. Turner, barked, snapping her fingers impatiently. "The gala starts in an hour, and we can't have slackers tonight." "Yes, ma'am," Emma answered quickly, forcing herself to move faster. Tonight, the hotel was hosting the Knight Corporation Annual Gala, an event for the richest and most powerful figures in the city. It was the kind of party where women wore glittering gowns and men sipped expensive whiskey, talking about billion-dollar deals as if they were discussing the weather. And Emma? She was just a maid. Invisible. Unimportant. She picked up a tray of champagne glasses and followed the other servers into the grand ballroom. The chandeliers sparkled like diamonds, the marble floors gleamed under the warm golden lights, and a soft melody played in the background. Guests were already arriving, men in tailored suits, women in elegant dresses, laughter filling the room like music. Emma swallowed hard. She didn't belong in a place like this. "Careful where you walk," one of the waitresses whispered, nudging her. "There's a VIP section tonight, and if you spill anything on those people, you're as good as fired." Emma's heart pounded. She couldn't afford to lose this job. Taking a deep breath, she carefully moved through the crowd, balancing the tray in her hands. She was almost at the VIP table when she suddenly felt something, or rather, someone, collide into her. The tray wobbled. The glasses tipped. And before she could stop it, crash! Champagne spilled all over the expensive black suit of the man standing before her. Emma's blood ran cold. The entire room seemed to fall silent. Guests turned, whispering in hushed tones. She looked up and met the most piercing icy blue eyes she had ever seen. Alexander Knight. The billionaire CEO. The man who practically owned half the city. The most powerful person in the room. His face was unreadable, his sharp jaw tightening as he slowly looked down at his now ruined suit. The contrast between his calm exterior and the deadly energy radiating from him made Emma want to sink into the floor. She panicked. I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, grabbing a napkin and desperately dabbing at his suit. "It was an accident, I swear." "Stop," he said, his voice low, deep, and commanding. Emma froze. His eyes locked onto her, making her feel small and exposed. From the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Turner rushing toward them, her face red with anger. "Emma Carter," she hissed. "What have you done?" "You clumsy fool." Mrs. Turner continued, grabbing Emma's arm. "Apologize properly, and then get out. You're fired." Emma's stomach dropped. "No, please, I need this job," she pleaded. Mrs. Turner ignored her and turned to Alexander. "Sir, I sincerely apologize for this girl's incompetence." "I assure you, she won't." "She stays," Alexander cut in abruptly. Emma's breath hitched. Mrs. Turner blinked, confused. "Yes, sir?" Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, his movements slow and controlled. "It was an accident," he said smoothly. "No need to fire her over spilled champagne." Emma stared at him, shocked. Was he defending her? Mrs. Turner hesitated, then forced a smile. "Oh, of course, Mr. Knight. Whatever you say." Emma exhaled in relief. "Thank you," she whispered. He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze lingered on her for a second too long before he turned away, his presence commanding the room once more. Emma didn't know why her heart was pounding so hard. But one thing was certain, this wasn't the last time she would see Alexander Knight. And it was just the beginning of a night that would change her life forever. The night had barely begun, and Emma was already exhausted. She had spent the last 3 hours rushing between tables, refilling drinks, and dodging impatient guests who barely acknowledged her presence. The Knight Corporation annual gala was the biggest event of the year, and as a hotel maid turned server for the night, Emma knew she had to be extra careful. One mistake, and she'd be out of a job. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up a silver tray filled with expensive wine. The deep red liquid swirled like velvet inside the crystal glasses, ready to be served to the VIP section. She took a deep breath. Just get through tonight. No mistakes. No attention. Emma moved through the crowd, balancing the tray carefully as she approached the most exclusive table in the room. And that's when it happened. A guest near her turned too quickly, his elbow knocking into Emma's arm. The tray wobbled. Her heart stopped. Before she could regain control, the wine glasses tipped over, and time seemed to slow down as the deep red liquid spilled right onto the expensive black suit of the man sitting at the table. Silence. Emma's stomach dropped. Every guest around her froze, their eyes darting between her and the man now staring at his ruined suit. Her breath caught as she recognized him. Alexander Knight. The CEO. The billionaire. The most powerful man in the room. His icy blue eyes lifted, locking onto hers, and Emma forgot how to breathe. His jaw tightened. His lips parted, but no words came out at first. He exhaled sharply, his fingers curling into a fist at his side. Emma's heart pounded. I am so sorry, sir," she stammered, grabbing a napkin from her pocket and reaching forward to dab at the stain. "I didn't mean to." "Stop." His deep, smooth voice sent shivers down her spine. Emma's hand froze mid-air. His gaze was unreadable, cold, piercing, and controlled, but something flickered behind those sharp blue eyes. Annoyance? Curiosity? Before she could figure it out, Mrs. Turner, her manager, stormed toward them, her face burning with rage. "Emma Carter," she snapped, her voice laced with venom. "You clumsy, incompetent girl. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Emma's throat closed up. I didn't mean to." "You're fired," Mrs. Turner cut in, her words slicing through the air. "Right now. Get out." Emma felt dizzy. She needed this job. She needed the money. Liam's medical bills. She opened her mouth to beg, but before she could say anything, "She stays." Emma's head snapped up. It was Alexander who had spoken. His voice was calm but firm, a quiet authority that commanded the entire room. Mrs. Turner looked stunned. "Yes, sir?" Alexander adjusted his cufflinks, his movements controlled. He didn't even spare Mrs. Turner a glance as he said, "It was an accident." "I don't fire people for accidents." Emma's lips parted, shock washing over her. Mrs. Turner hesitated, but when Alexander raised an eyebrow, she quickly forced a fake smile. "Oh, of course, Mr. Knight. Whatever you say." She turned to Emma, lowering her voice to a hiss. "You got lucky. Now, get out of my sight." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She turned and walked away, her heart still racing. The event had finally ended. Guests had left, the music had stopped, and the hotel halls were eerily quiet. Emma slipped into one of the unused VIP suites, hoping for just 5 minutes of rest. The plush sofa looked inviting, and she sank into it, exhaling. Her head buzzed. The entire night had been a disaster, but the one thing she couldn't stop thinking about was him. Alexander Knight. Why had he defended her? She knew men like him. Rich, powerful, untouchable. People like him didn't even look at people like her. And yet, he had spared her job. Why? Emma shook her head, pushing the thought away. It didn't matter. She would never see him again. But fate had other plans. The door swung open. Emma sat bolt upright, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, and his expression unreadable, was none other than Alexander Knight. Emma's heart stopped. His gaze narrowed. "What are you doing here?" Emma's cheeks flushed. I just needed a moment to sit down." For a moment, he just stared at her, as if debating something in his mind. Then, with a sigh, he stepped inside and shut the door. Emma's pulse raced. He walked over to the minibar and poured himself a drink. The golden liquid swirled in his glass as he took a sip. She should have left. She knew she should. But instead, she blurted out the question burning in her mind. "Why did you stop my manager from firing me?" Alexander looked at her, amusement flickering in his gaze. "You think I should have let her?" Emma swallowed. "No, I don't understand why you helped me." His expression darkened slightly. "I don't know." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, to her surprise, he offered her a glass of whiskey. Emma hesitated. "I don't really drink." "Neither do I," he admitted, "but tonight, I make an exception." Something in his voice made her pause. He sounded tired. For the first time, she noticed the tension in his jaw, the slight furrow of his brows. He looked troubled. "Rough night?" she asked before she could stop herself. Alexander let out a dry chuckle. "You have no idea." Emma bit her lip. She should leave. She knew she should. But something about the way he sat there, his usually cold demeanor softened by exhaustion, made her stay. One drink turned into two. One conversation turned into an entire hour of talking about things they shouldn't have talked about. And then a silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was charged. He was looking at her now, really looking, and suddenly, she couldn't breathe. His hand reached up, his fingers brushing against her cheek so softly it sent shivers down her spine. Emma. She should stop this. She didn't. And when he leaned in, when his lips met hers, she forgot every reason why she should. That night, Emma Carter made a mistake she would never be able to take back. And her world was about to change forever. A soft glow of morning light seeped through the heavy curtains, casting long shadows across the luxurious suite. The air was still, save for the faint sound of rhythmic breathing beside her. Emma Carter stirred, her mind foggy, her body aching in unfamiliar places. Then, suddenly, it hit her. Her eyes snapped open. She wasn't in her small apartment. She was in a lavish king-sized bed, tangled in silk sheets that didn't belong to her. And beside her was him. Alexander Knight. The billionaire CEO. And he was asleep, his chiseled features relaxed for the first time, his normally sharp eyes closed, his chest rising and falling with deep, even breaths. Emma's heart pounded. No, no, no. She sat up so fast that the sheets slid off her bare skin, sending a chill down her spine. She clutched them to her chest, her breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. Memories of the previous night came flooding back. The whiskey. The soft conversation. The way he looked at her. The way she let him kiss her. The way she kissed him back. The way it didn't stop there. "Oh my God," she whispered. Her stomach twisted in knots. "What have I done?" She turned to look at Alexander again, still deep in sleep, his arm carelessly resting over where she had been lying. He looked peaceful, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. Emma had no idea what had come over her last night. One moment, she had been sitting there, listening to him talk in that low, hypnotic voice, and the next, she had given herself to him. And now, she had to get out of here. Moving carefully, Emma peeled the sheets off her body and slid out of bed. Her dress from the night before lay crumpled on the floor. She grabbed it, hastily slipping it back on, her hands shaking as she zipped it up. She stole one last glance at Alexander. She should wake him up. She should talk to him. But fear clutched her chest. He was a powerful man, and she was just horror. A maid. A nobody. To him, last night probably meant nothing. She clenched her jaw, swallowed the lump in her throat, and turned toward the door. Her bare feet barely made a sound as she slipped out of the room, quiet as a ghost. And just like that, she was gone. The smell of expensive cologne and whiskey lingered in the air. Alexander stirred, his head pounding lightly, a faint reminder of the whiskey he had allowed himself last night. He rarely drank. And he certainly never let his guard down. But last night had been different. His eyes blinked open, adjusting to the dim light, his body stretching lazily against the soft silk sheets. And then, as if a switch flipped in his mind, memories crashed into him like a wave. His gaze darted to the empty space beside him. She was gone. He sat up, brows furrowing, eyes scanning the room. The faint indent in the mattress beside him, the lingering scent of vanilla on the pillow, proof that she had been there. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, frustration flickering in his chest. Emma. That was her name. He remembered the way she had looked at him, hesitant yet completely captivated. He remembered the way she had shivered beneath his touch, the way her lips had parted when he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. But she was gone. And for some reason, that bothered him. Emma ran down the empty hotel corridor, her heart racing like a drum. She needed to leave. Now. Reaching the staff locker room, she threw open her locker and snatched her bag. Her fingers fumbled as she grabbed her phone, dialing the only person she could trust right now. The call rang twice before her best friend, Lily, picked up. Emma? Why are you calling me so early? I need to get out of here, Emma whispered, her voice frantic. Can I come over? There was a brief silence. Then, Lily's voice softened. Emma, what happened? Emma swallowed hard, gripping the phone tighter. I made a mistake, she said, barely holding back the tremble in her voice. Okay. Just come over, Lily said gently. We'll talk. Emma nodded, even though Lily couldn't see her. Thank you. She ended the call and let out a shaky breath. There was only one more thing left to do. Emma found Mrs. Turner in her office, flipping through paperwork. The woman barely looked up when Emma entered. What do you want? She asked, her tone already exasperated. Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. I quit, she said, her voice firm. That got Mrs. Turner's attention. She glanced up, brows raised. Excuse me? You heard me, Emma said, gripping her bag. I quit. Mrs. Turner scoffed. You can't just walk out of here, Carter. You need this job. Emma clenched her jaw. No. I needed this job. But I can't stay here anymore. Mrs. Turner studied her for a moment, then smirked. Let me guess. This is about last night, isn't it? Emma's stomach dropped. She forced herself to remain calm. I don't know what you're talking about. Mrs. Turner leaned back in her chair, arms crossed. Please. You think I don't notice things? 1 minute you're working, the next you disappear. And this morning, I hear whispers about a certain billionaire CEO asking if anyone saw you leave. Emma's heart skipped a beat. Alexander had asked about her? She shoved that thought away. It didn't matter. She lifted her chin, standing tall. I don't owe you an explanation. Just process my resignation. Mrs. Turner shrugged. Suit yourself. Emma turned on her heel and walked out of the office, not looking back. As Emma stepped into the cold morning air, a weight lifted off her chest. She was free. Last night was a mistake, and she would put it behind her. She'd find a new job, focus on Liam, and pretend none of this ever happened. She had escaped before it got complicated. Or at least, she thought she had. Because what Emma didn't know was that Alexander Knight was already looking for her. And when a man like him wanted something, he never let it go. Emma clutched the edge of the bathroom sink, her knuckles turning white as another wave of dizziness hit her. Her stomach twisted, the familiar nausea bubbling up in her throat. She squeezed her eyes shut, breathing deeply, willing herself not to throw up again. She had been feeling off for weeks now, tired, dizzy, her body aching in ways she couldn't explain. At first, she had blamed stress. Losing her job, searching for a new one, and taking care of Liam had left her exhausted. But now, she wasn't so sure. A sharp knock on the bathroom door made her jump.
Emma?
Lily's voice came from the other side.
You okay in there?
Emma swallowed hard.
Why yeah, I'm fine. She wasn't fine.
She knew what this could be. And she was terrified. Her trembling fingers reached for the small white box sitting on the counter. A pregnancy test. She had bought it on the way home after nearly fainting at work. The cashier had given her a knowing look, but Emma had been too distracted by her racing thoughts to care. It's probably nothing, she told herself. Just stress. Or maybe a stomach bug. But deep down, she knew the truth. Taking a deep breath, she ripped open the box and followed the instructions. Then, she set the test down and waited. 2 minutes. That's all it took. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears as she stared at the stick. And then, 2 pink lines. Her world spun. Her breath hitched. Her chest tightened. No. No. She blinked, hoping she had read it wrong. But the result stayed the same. She was pregnant. With Alexander Knight's baby. Her legs gave out, and she slumped to the floor, her back pressing against the cold tiles. This wasn't supposed to happen. It was just one night. A mistake. Something she had tried to forget. But now, she had a tiny life growing inside her. She pressed a hand against her flat stomach, terror and disbelief crashing over her like a tidal wave. What was she supposed to do? She could barely take care of herself and Liam, how could she raise a child? Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but before they could fall, the bathroom door swung open. Lily stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her sharp eyes narrowing. You've been in here for ages, she said. Then she spotted the pregnancy test on the floor. Her eyes widened. Emma, Lily's voice softened. Oh my God. Are you? Emma nodded weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm pregnant. Lily let out a breath, running a hand through her hair. Shit. Emma gave a wet, shaky laugh. Yeah. Pretty much. Lily knelt beside her, resting a gentle hand on her arm. Okay. First things first, breathe. Emma sucked in a deep breath. Then another. But the panic still sat heavy in her chest. What the hell am I going to do? Emma's voice broke. I can't raise a baby alone, Lily. I can barely afford rent. Liam's hospital bills are piling up. I have no job, no savings, and... She cut herself off, her throat tightening. Lily was silent for a moment, then asked carefully, Does the father know? Emma froze. Her stomach twisted. Alexander. His face flashed in her mind, those icy blue eyes, the way he had looked at her that night, the way he had saved her job when he didn't have to. She had disappeared from his life without a word. He probably didn't even remember her. And even if he did, he wasn't the type of man to want a baby. He doesn't know, Emma admitted, her voice small. Lily's brows furrowed. You need to tell him. Emma shook her head violently. No. No way. He's a billionaire, Lily. He has an empire to run. He's probably engaged to some rich socialite by now. He doesn't need me ruining his life with this. Lily gave her a lone look. Emma, this isn't just about you. This is his baby, too. He deserves to know. Emma's chest ached. She wanted to believe that telling him would change something, that he'd step up, that he'd want to be a part of the baby's life. But men like Alexander Knight? They didn't do family. He'll try to take the baby away from me, Emma whispered, fear creeping into her voice. He has money, power. If he wants custody, he'll get it.
Lily frowned but didn't argue. Instead, she said, "So what are you going to do?" Emma closed her eyes. She didn't know. But one thing was clear, she couldn't tell Alexander. Not now. Not ever.
Alexander Knight sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the city skyline, his jaw clenched. He had been trying to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting.
To her. Emma.
It had been 2 months, but he couldn't stop thinking about that night. The way she had looked at him with those big, nervous eyes. The way her skin had felt against his. The way she had disappeared before he could say a damn thing. He had tried to find her, but she had vanished without a trace.
And it bothered him. More than it should.
"You're distracted." Alexander turned, finding Vanessa Blake leaning against his desk, arms crossed.
His so-called fiancée. It wasn't a real engagement.
Their families had pushed for it, but he had no interest in marrying her.
She knew that.
Vanessa studied him with sharp eyes.
"Still thinking about that girl, aren't you?" Alexander didn't answer. Vanessa smirked. "She's gone, Alex. Forget her." He should. He had a company to run, an empire to expand. He didn't have time to chase ghosts. And yet, his gut told him he hadn't seen the last of Emma Carter. Emma Carter sat in yet another stuffy office, fidgeting nervously as the hiring manager scanned her resume. "Miss Carter, you don't have much experience outside of housekeeping and waitressing," the woman said, adjusting her glasses. "We're looking for someone with at least 2 years of administrative work." Emma swallowed the lump of disappointment in her throat. "I'm a fast learner," she insisted, forcing a hopeful smile. "I'm organized, great with people, and..." The woman sighed, cutting her off. "I'm sorry, but we need someone with more qualifications." Another rejection. Emma nodded stiffly, gathered her papers, and walked out of the office, her chest tightening. She had applied for over a dozen jobs in the past 2 weeks. No one would hire her. Her growing stomach wasn't helping. Even if they didn't ask, they noticed. And no one wanted to hire a pregnant woman who would need maternity leave soon. She stepped out onto the busy city sidewalk, the sharp autumn wind biting at her skin. Her baby bump was barely visible, but she felt every bit of its weight, not just physically, but emotionally. She had to figure something out. Fast. For herself. For her baby. For the life she was about to bring into the world alone. Later that day, Emma sat in a sterile white hospital room, waiting for her doctor to return with her checkup results. She placed a hand on her belly, a strange warmth spreading through her chest. Despite the fear, the uncertainty, and the loneliness, she knew one thing: she already loved this baby more than anything. "Mommy's going to figure this out," she whispered softly. Just then, the door swung open, and the nurse smiled at her. "Everything looks good so far," she said, handing Emma a few papers. "Your blood pressure is stable, and the baby's heart rate is strong." Emma let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "That's great," she murmured. "Do you want to schedule your next ultrasound?" Emma hesitated. Money was tight. But she needed to make sure the baby was healthy. "Yes," she finally said. "I'll figure it out." The nurse nodded and stepped out. Emma gathered her things, preparing to leave, but as she stepped into the hallway, she froze. Just a few feet away, standing tall in his perfectly tailored suit, was Alexander Knight. Her stomach flipped. For a split second, she hoped he wouldn't notice her. But then, as if sensing her presence, he turned his head and their eyes locked. Time stopped. His brows furrowed at first, confusion flashing across his face. Then his sharp blue eyes dropped to her stomach. Emma's breath hitched. Alexander's face hardened. He took a step forward, his entire body radiating tension. "Emma?" His voice was low, unreadable. Emma's heart pounded. "Run!" Every instinct screamed at her. She turned on her heel and walked the other way. "Emma!"
His voice was sharper now, edged with something that sounded dangerously close to realization.
But she didn't stop. She couldn't.
She pushed through the hallway, weaving between doctors and nurses, her hands shaking.
She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for him. But Alexander Knight was not a man who let things go.
Before she could reach the exit, a strong hand closed around her wrist. She gasped as Alexander spun her around, his grip firm but not painful. Her chest tightened as she stared up at him. His face was unreadable, but his eyes burned with a storm of emotions, confusion, anger, and something deeper.
"Why are you running?"
His voice was dangerously quiet.
Emma yanked her hand back, stepping away. "I have nothing to say to you." Alexander's jaw clenched.
His gaze flickered to her stomach again, and Emma instinctively placed a protective hand over it. His eyes darkened.
"Emma," he said, voice lower now. "Tell me the truth. Is it mine?"
The words hit her like a truck.
She should lie. She should tell him no and walk away.
But standing there, with his piercing gaze locked onto her, she couldn't force the words out.
Silence. And that silence was all the answer he needed. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "You were going to keep this from me?"
Emma folded her arms, lifting her chin.
"I don't owe you anything." His expression turned icy. "You don't think I have a right to know I have a child on the way?"
Her fingers tightened around the ultrasound papers in her hand. "You don't get to storm in and demand answers after 2 months of nothing, Alexander."
His eyes narrowed. "I didn't even know where you were, Emma. You disappeared." "Because I had to," she snapped. "You don't understand what it's like to be me. To have nothing. To be afraid that the father of your child, a billionaire, will use his power to take your baby away." Alexander's expression flickered, something unreadable passing through his eyes. "You think I would take your child from you?" She exhaled shakily. "I don't know. But I couldn't take that risk."
His gaze softened, just for a moment.
"Emma."
She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. "This is my baby," she whispered.
"And I won't let you decide what happens now."
His jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides.
"You think you can just shut me out of this?"
His voice was low, controlled, but there was an edge of raw emotion beneath it.
Emma bit her lip. She didn't have an answer to that. Because deep down, she knew. Alexander Knight wasn't going to let this go.
And for the first time since she saw those 2 pink lines on that test, she realized.
She had just stepped into a storm she couldn't outrun. Dangerous in them. "Don't do that. Don't act like I don't have a right to be involved in this." Emma stepped back, trying to put distance between them.
"You don't get to show up after 2 months and suddenly demand to be a part of this."
"I didn't show up, Emma. I found you by accident because you ran."
She bit her lip, frustration building inside her.
"Because I had no choice."
Alexander scoffed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking more ruffled than she had ever seen him. "You didn't even give me a chance," he said, his voice tight.
"You assumed I'd be the villain in this story. That I'd take the baby away from you." Emma stayed silent. Because, honestly,
she had assumed that. A man like Alexander Knight, powerful, ruthless, used to getting what he wanted, could easily win custody if he wanted to. She had been protecting herself. Protecting her baby. Alexander studied her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was calmer, steadier, but just as intense.
"Let's make a deal." Emma's breath hitched. "What?"
"You're struggling," he said, cutting straight to the truth. "You need a stable place to live, you need money, and you need support."
"I can give you all of that."
Her stomach twisted.
"What are you saying?" "I'm saying, move in with me." Emma's heart stopped.
She stared at him like he had just grown another head.
"You can't be serious."
He crossed his arms.
"Completely serious." Emma let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. You think I'm just going to pack up and move into your mansion because you suddenly decided to care? His jaw tightened. I don't make offers lightly, Emma. Well, then, take this one back.
His eyes flashed with frustration.
Think about what's best for the baby.
Her hands curled into fists.
I am thinking about what's best for the baby. And that's not living in some cold penthouse with a father who doesn't know the first thing about love or family.
His face hardened, but this time, something flickered behind his expression, a shadow of something deeper, something unreadable.
Emma exhaled, pressing a hand against her growing belly. I can do this on my own.
His gaze dropped to her hand, lingering there for a moment before meeting her eyes again. Maybe you can, he admitted, his voice quieter now.
But you shouldn't have to.
Something in the way he said it made her chest ache. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, frowning as she saw Lily's name.
Hello? Emma, it's Liam.
Her blood ran cold.
What? What happened? He collapsed, Lily's voice was frantic. We're at the hospital right now. Emma's legs went weak. No. Liam had been doing okay.
He was taking his medication.
This wasn't supposed to happen.
I'll be right there, she choked out before hanging up and turning to run. But before she could take a step, Alexander grabbed her wrist.
What happened?
His voice was sharp, his expression serious. My brother, she whispered, her voice cracking.
He's sick. I need to go. Without hesitation, Alexander pulled out his phone.
I'll have my driver take you.
Emma blinked, stunned. You don't have to. I know.
His expression softened just slightly.
But I will. For once, she didn't argue. The hospital smelled of sterile antiseptic and fear. Emma rushed inside, finding Lily pacing in the waiting area. Where is he? Emma gasped. Lily pointed down the hall.
They're running tests, but, Emma, the doctor said he needs surgery soon.
Emma's stomach twisted painfully.
Surgery.
Which cost money. Money she didn't have.
Her vision blurred as she clutched the chair beside her. Liam was all she had. If she lost him. A hand touched her shoulder. She turned, finding Alexander standing beside her. His expression was unreadable, but his next words shattered her last wall of resistance. I'll pay for it, he said.
Emma's breath caught in her throat. What? Your brother's surgery. I'll cover everything.
She stared at him, emotions crashing over her like a tidal wave.
She wanted to say no.
To tell him she didn't need his help.
To keep fighting alone. But this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Liam.
And the tiny life growing inside her.
Emma closed her eyes for a long moment.
Then, slowly, painfully, she whispered, okay.
Alexander nodded once, his expression unreadable. But Emma knew the truth.
She had just made a deal with the devil. And there was no turning back now.
Emma stood in the middle of Alexander Knight's penthouse, feeling completely out of place.
The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a breathtaking view of the city skyline, the soft glow of the setting sun reflecting off the glass like something out of a dream. Everything inside the penthouse screamed wealth, from the polished marble floors to the leather furniture that looked like it cost more than her entire life savings. She clutched her small suitcase tightly, her heart pounding. This wasn't her world. And yet, here she was. A deep voice broke the silence.
I'll have someone prepare a room for you. Emma turned to see Alexander, standing a few feet away.
He had already loosened his tie, his sleeves rolled up, making him look a little less like the cold billionaire she had met at the gala and more like something else.
Something almost human. She lifted her chin. I don't need special treatment. A couch will do just fine.
His brows furrowed, irritation flickering in his eyes.
You're pregnant with my child. You're not sleeping on a couch.
His tone left no room for argument.
Emma sighed, shifting her weight.
She had agreed to move in for Liam's sake, but that didn't mean she was comfortable with this arrangement. "I don't want to be your charity case," she muttered.
Alexander's jaw tightened. "You're not." She gave him a skeptical look. "Then what am I?"
For a second, his expression flickered with something unreadable, but then, just as quickly, his usual cold mask was back. "The mother of my child," he said simply.
Emma's stomach twisted at the words.
She had to remind herself this wasn't real.
Alexander wasn't suddenly a caring partner. He wasn't doing this out of love.
This was an obligation to him. And she wouldn't let herself forget that. The first few days in the penthouse were strange.
Alexander barely spoke unless it was necessary.
He would leave early for work, return late, and mostly keep his distance. Which was fine by her. But every now and then, he did things that confused her. Like the time he brought home a pregnancy pillow after overhearing her complain about back pain. Or when he told his housekeeper to prepare extra meals for her, making sure she ate enough. Or the night he found her sitting on the penthouse balcony, staring at the city lights, and instead of walking away, he just stood there with her, silent, but present. He was watching her, Emma realized.
And that was dangerous.
Because every time she caught him staring, her heart betrayed her, beating just a little too fast. It didn't take long for Vanessa Blake to find out. Emma felt her presence before she even saw her. The sharp click of designer heels against the floor, the heavy scent of expensive perfume, and then the unmistakable sound of a bored, condescending voice.
"So, it's true."
Emma turned to see Vanessa standing in the penthouse foyer, dressed in an elegant red dress that screamed wealth and arrogance. Vanessa's eyes swept over her, lingering on Emma's stomach before curling her lips into a mocking smirk. The maid turned mistress, Vanessa mused, crossing her arms.
How predictable. Emma's hands curled into fists.
"I'm not his mistress," she said firmly. Vanessa let out a soft laugh, tilting her head.
"Oh, sweetie. You don't have to lie.
We both know why you're here."
Emma stood her ground.
"I'm here for my baby."
"That's it." Vanessa's eyes darkened. "And yet, you're living in his home. Sleeping in his bed." "I'm not."
"Oh, but you will be," Vanessa cut her off, stepping closer.
"Because men like Alexander? They don't keep women like you around unless they plan to use you." Emma's breath caught. Vanessa leaned in, lowering her voice. "You think you're special? You're nothing but a distraction. And once he's bored,
he'll throw you out like all the others."
Emma's chest tightened, but before she could respond,
a deep voice cut through the tension.
"Vanessa." Emma flinched at the coldness in Alexander's tone.
He stood at the entrance, his blue eyes like ice, his entire body tense. Vanessa turned, flashing a sweet, fake smile.
"Alex, darling.
I was just having a chat with your little house guest."
Alexander's jaw ticked. "Leave." Vanessa blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?"
"I said leave." His tone was sharper now, a warning laced beneath it.
Emma could see the moment Vanessa realized this wasn't just about a fling. This was different.
And that terrified her.
Vanessa's expression twisted into something ugly. "You're making a mistake." Alexander didn't even blink. "I don't make mistakes." Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, then turned her gaze back to Emma.
"I hope you're enjoying your little fantasy," she sneered.
"Because it won't last."
And with that, she spun on her heel and walked out. The room fell silent. Emma felt her fingernails dig into her palms, her heart racing. She turned to Alexander.
"She hates me."
He shrugged, completely unfazed.
"I don't care." She frowned. "Maybe you should. She's your fiancée, isn't she?"
His eyes flickered.
"Not for much longer." Emma's breath caught.
But before she could ask what he meant, he stepped closer, his gaze locked onto her. "She was right about one thing," he said.
Emma's stomach dropped. "What?" Alexander's jaw clenched. I don't plan on letting you go. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what scared her more, Vanessa's threats or the undeniable possessiveness in Alexander's voice. One thing was clear. This arrangement? It was getting dangerously complicated. Emma sat stiffly in the hospital chair, waiting for the doctor to begin her ultrasound appointment.
She had been expecting to come alone.
But instead, Alexander was here.
He sat beside her, his large frame almost too big for the small chair, his eyes focused on the monitor as if this were a business deal he had to oversee. Emma had been shocked when he had announced, in his usual commanding tone, "I'm coming with you."
And now he was sitting here, waiting for their child's heartbeat, as if this was normal.
"All right, Miss Carter," the doctor said, applying the cool gel to Emma's stomach.
"Let's see how the baby's doing."
The moment the heartbeat filled the room, Emma felt her chest tighten with emotion.
She glanced at Alexander, expecting him to be indifferent.
Instead, he was staring at the screen, his jaw slightly slack, his blue eyes soft in a way she had never seen before. For the first time, he looked completely vulnerable. Emma's heart skipped. This was dangerous. She was starting to see a different side of him. And it terrified her. That night, a thunderstorm raged outside, lightning flashing through the large penthouse windows. Emma sat curled on the couch, hugging her knees, her mind a whirlwind of emotions.
This wasn't supposed to happen.
She had agreed to stay for practical reasons, not to get attached.
But Alexander was making it hard.
Every time he showed up for an appointment, every time he brought her something small, like ginger tea for her morning sickness, it chipped away at the walls she had so carefully built.
She felt trapped. Like she was sinking into something she couldn't control. And the worst part?
She didn't even know if Alexander truly cared.
"You're overthinking." Emma flinched, turning to see Alexander standing by the doorway, watching her.
His voice was calm but firm, as if he could read her mind.
"I'm not," she lied, rubbing her arms. I don't know how to do this."
He walked toward her, his expression unreadable.
"Do what?"
She swallowed hard.
"Be in this arrangement. Live here. Pretend this is normal."
Alexander sat beside her on the couch, his presence overwhelming but strangely
comforting. "You don't have to pretend," he said quietly. Emma let out a bitter laugh. "Easy for you to say. You're used to controlling everything. But me?
She shook her head.
I feel like I'm losing myself."
Alexander was silent for a moment, then, to her surprise, he reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear.
Her breath caught. "You're not losing yourself," he murmured.
"You're just scared."
Emma's eyes stung. "Maybe," she whispered.
A crack of thunder shook the building, and without thinking, Emma gripped his wrist, holding onto him.
She expected him to pull away.
Instead, he stayed still, his gaze locked onto hers. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this.
And that? That was the scariest feeling of all.
The next morning, Emma's peaceful moment was shattered. She had barely stepped out of the penthouse when she heard the whispers.
"Did you hear?
The girl living with Alexander Knight, she's a gold digger. She trapped him with a baby.
She's nothing but a maid who got lucky." Emma's stomach turned. Vanessa. She didn't even have to ask. The rumors had Vanessa Blake's fingerprints all over them. Emma clenched her fists, fighting back the anger and humiliation.
She should have expected this. People would never see her as anything more than a nobody trying to climb the social ladder.
And Alexander? What did he think? Did he believe them?
She turned on her heel, storming back into the penthouse, slamming the door behind her. Alexander looked up from his laptop, frowning.
"What happened?" Emma glared at him. "People are saying I'm a gold digger."
His eyes darkened.
"Who?" Emma let out a sharp laugh. "Who do you think?" "Vanessa." Alexander exhaled slowly, closing his laptop. I'll handle it.
Emma shook her head, frustration boiling over.
That's not the point, Alexander. The point is, do you believe them? He stiffened. No. Then why does it feel like you do? She snapped. You've never actually told me why you're doing this. Is it just about responsibility? About keeping your precious reputation intact? Alexander stood, his blue eyes stormy with something dangerous.
I don't care about my reputation, he said.
I care about you. Emma's breath hitched.
For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, before she could stop herself, she whispered, I don't believe you. Alexander stepped closer, until she could feel his warmth.
Then let me prove it, he murmured. Emma's heart pounded.
Because part of her wanted to let him.
And that? That was more terrifying than anything Vanessa Blake could ever say.
Emma had just stepped out of the shower when her phone buzzed. Wrapping a towel around herself, she glanced at the screen.
Unknown number.
Frowning, she hesitated before opening the message.
Her breath caught in her throat.
Attached to the message was a document, a legal-looking one, stamped with the Knight Corporation seal. And right there, in bold black letters, were the words.
Custody Agreement. Alexander Knight will assume full custody of the unborn child upon birth. Emma Carter will waive all parental rights. Her heart stopped. No. This couldn't be real. With trembling fingers, she scrolled down and saw Alexander's signature at the bottom.
Tears blurred her vision.
She couldn't breathe.
He had planned this all along. All the kindness, all the moments when he showed up for doctor's appointments, all the small gestures, it had all been a lie.
She had been a fool. Her phone buzzed again. Another message. Vanessa, I told you, sweetheart.
Men like Alexander don't fall for women like you.
He's just taking what's his. Emma's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto the bed, her chest aching with betrayal. She had let herself believe in him. But he had only been waiting for the right moment to take her baby away. By the time Alexander got home that night, the penthouse was silent. Too silent. Something felt off. Emma, he called out. No answer. His stomach tightened.
He walked to her bedroom, pushing the door open only to find the closet empty.
His heart dropped.
Rushing to the bedside table, he found a single folded note.
He opened it, scanning the shaky handwriting. Alexander. I should have known better.
I don't belong in your world, and I won't let you take my baby away from me.
Don't look for me. It's over. Emma.
His grip tightened on the paper. What the hell, he muttered, his jaw clenching.
She thought he wanted to take the baby from her? Where was this coming from?
He pulled out his phone and called her.
Straight to voicemail. Panic gripped his chest.
She was gone.
Alexander stormed into his office, throwing the note onto his desk.
He ran a frustrated hand through his hair.
Emma thought he was taking the baby away from her? Who told her that? His mind raced. Then it hit him. Vanessa.
With burning fury, he grabbed his phone and dialed her number. She picked up after one ring.
Well, that was fast, she purred. Miss me already? His jaw tightened. What the hell did you do? A dramatic sigh. Oh, Alex. You make it sound so.
Don't play games with me, he snapped.
What did you tell Emma? A beat of silence. Then Vanessa let out a mocking laugh. Oh, she drawled. She finally ran, didn't she? Alexander's fists clenched. What did you do?
His voice was low, dangerous.
Vanessa hummed.
I may have shown her some legal paperwork.
She deserved to know what was coming. Alexander's blood turned ice cold. You forged legal documents? She believed it, didn't she? Vanessa laughed. That's the important part. Rage exploded inside him. You ruined everything, he hissed. Vanessa's amusement faded. Oh, come on, Alex. She was never going to fit into your life. She's a maid. A nobody. I just saved you from a scandal. I don't give a damn about scandals. His voice was like a blade. Vanessa scoffed. Then why are you so mad? It's not like you actually love her. Silence. Alexander's chest tightened. He could lie to Vanessa. He could pretend none of this mattered. But deep down, the truth was clear. He did love her. And now? She was gone. Goodbye, Vanessa, he said coldly. She gasped. Wait, Alex. He hung up. Then he turned on his computer and pulled up security footage. He watched the video of Emma leaving the penthouse, carrying a single bag. His gut twisted painfully. She was out there alone, carrying his child, thinking he had betrayed her. And he would not let it end like this. The next morning, Alexander stood in his office, barking orders into his phone. I want eyes everywhere, he said. Check bus stations, airports, train routes, find her. His assistant hesitated. Sir, do you have any idea where she might have gone? Alexander exhaled sharply. Where would she go? Then it hit him. Liam. Emma would never leave her brother behind. Start in her old neighborhood, he ordered. And call every hospital in the city. If she's pregnant, she'll need checkups. Find her doctor. He hung up and stared out the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands clenching into fists. He had one chance to fix this. One chance to prove to Emma that she was not alone in this. And he would move heaven and earth to find her. Because losing her? That was not an option. Emma clutched her belly, pain shooting through her as she stumbled through the quiet streets. Not now. Please, not now. She had been feeling contractions all day, but she had ignored them. She couldn't go to the hospital, not when she had no one by her side. She had no choice but to keep walking. Then, suddenly, her water broke. A sharp cry escaped her lips as she doubled over, gripping a lamppost to steady herself. Her breaths came in short, painful gasps. Panic set in. She was alone. She was about to give birth, and she had nowhere to go. And then, out of nowhere, headlights flooded the street. A black car screeched to a stop, and before she could even process what was happening, a familiar, tall figure stepped out. Alexander. Her heart stopped. His eyes locked onto her, widening as he took in the scene. Emma. His voice was raw, urgent as he rushed to her. She wanted to push him away, to tell him to leave, but the pain was too much. A sob escaped her lips. It's happening, she gasped. The baby. Without hesitation, Alexander scooped her up into his arms. Hold on, he murmured. I've got you. The drive to the hospital was a blur of pain and panic. Emma's nails dug into the leather seat as another contraction ripped through her. Alexander sat beside her, gripping her hand tightly. Breathe, Emma. Just hold on. Tears streamed down her face. I can't do this alone. You're not alone, he said fiercely. I'm right here. I'm never leaving again. She wanted to believe him. But what if it was too late? The hospital room was chaos. Doctors and nurses rushed around her, voices blending together, but all she could hear was her own ragged breathing. Alexander never let go of her hand. You're doing amazing, he whispered, brushing damp hair from her forehead. Emma's body trembled. I can't. Yes, you can. His voice was gentle but strong. You're the strongest person I know, Emma. You can do this. She squeezed his hand with all her strength. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a sharp cry filled the room. Her heart stopped. The doctor lifted a tiny, wriggling baby, his voice warm. It's a boy. A sob broke from Emma's chest. Her baby. Her son. They placed him in her arms, and as she gazed down at his tiny face, everything else melted away.
Alexander leaned over, staring at the baby with a look she had never seen before, pure, raw emotion.
He's perfect, Alexander murmured, his voice almost reverent. Emma's breath hitched. Tears streamed down her face. And then, the words she never expected. I love you, Emma. Her head snapped up, eyes wide.
Alexander's gaze was steady, unshaken.
I love you, he repeated, his voice soft but firm. And I love him. I was an idiot for letting you go, for not telling you sooner. But I swear to you, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I mean it. Emma's chest ached.
This man, the same man she once thought was cold and unreachable, was sitting here, confessing everything. She searched his face, looking for hesitation, doubt, anything that would prove he wasn't serious. But she found none.
Just love. Real, undeniable love.
She let out a shaky breath, her heart pounding.
I love you too, she whispered.
Alexander's lips parted, his eyes darkening with emotion.
Then, ever so gently, he cupped her face and kissed hers soft, deep, full of every unsaid word.
And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt safe.
Vanessa Blake's world crumbled when the truth about her lies came out.
Alexander had exposed her forging documents, ensuring she was blacklisted from every elite circle in the city.
She tried to fight back, to beg, but Alexander simply walked away.
Stay out of my life, he had told her coldly. Or I'll make sure you regret it. And with that, Vanessa Blake was gone. Days later, Emma sat in the penthouse, holding her son while Alexander watched them with a soft smile.
He had been there for every moment.
Every diaper change, every sleepless night, everything.
And Emma knew, deep down, that this was real.
That this was where she belonged. She turned to Alexander, her heart swelling. You really meant it, didn't you? She murmured.
He frowned slightly. Meant what?
That you love me, she whispered.
Alexander's expression softened. I meant every word. And then, gently, he kissed her again.
Their son cooed softly between them, and Emma let out a soft laugh.
This was it. Their new beginning. And she wouldn't have it any other way.